When the Navy SEALs boat died in a Pacific storm, Staff Sergeant Sarah Mitchell volunteered for what her commander called suicide, swimming 2 miles through killer currents to reach an abandoned lighthouse. Her father died believing she'd eclipse every man in the military. Tonight, with 50,000 lives hanging on 14 precision shots, she'd either prove him right or join him. This is the story of the woman who refused to drown even when the ocean wanted her dead. I'm the only asset you have left. Female Marines Impossible, 2 Mile Swim Through Hell, Part 1, Blood and Water. The morning fog rolled across San Diego Bay like a living thing, gray and cold and heavy with the promise of storms. Staff Sergeant Vespera Kane stood before the memorial wall at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado, her dress blues crisp despite the California humidity. The black granite reflected her image back at her, superimposing the living over the names of the dead. Her finger traced across the carved letters, Senior Chief David Kane, SEAL Team 6, killed in action, Syria 2019, age 51. 5 years. 5 years since the knock on their door in Virginia Beach, since her mother collapsed in the hallway, since the chaplain spoke words that meant nothing and everything. 5 years since Vespera decided she would follow her father into the darkness between nations, where warriors settled the world's problems with violence and precision. The memory came unbidden. She was 12, standing in their backyard while her father cleaned his rifle. The Remington 700 lay disassembled on an old wooden table, each component laid out with surgical precision. "Why do you do it, Dad?" she had asked, her voice small in the Virginia evening. David Kane looked up from the bolt he was inspecting. His hands were scarred from rope work and salt spray, marked by decades of operations she wasn't allowed to know about. He smiled, but it was a tired smile, the expression of a man who had seen too much and understood the cost of keeping the world safe. "Because someone has to stand in the gap, Vesper," he said, using the nickname he'd given her when she was too young to pronounce her own name. "Between the wolves and the sheep, between the darkness and the light. And I'm good at standing in dark places." He reached behind his neck and unclasped his dog tags. The metal was warm from his body heat, worn smooth by years of service. He placed them in her small palm and closed her fingers around them. "Someday you'll eclipse me," he said quietly. "You've got something I never had. Not just skill, not just determination. You can see yourself clearly, know your limits, and then ignore them. Promise me you'll go where I couldn't go." Where couldn't you go? Beyond the edge of what anyone thinks is possible. Promise me. She had promised. Standing there at 12 years old, holding her father's dog tags, she had promised. Now at 25, she understood what that promise meant. The sound of approaching footsteps pulled her back to the present. She turned to see Admiral Patricia Stone walking across the Memorial Plaza, her stride confident despite the prosthetic leg that replaced the one she'd lost to an IED outside Kandahar 7 years ago. Stone was a legend in naval special warfare circles. The first woman to command a SEAL team in combat operations, she had fought tooth and nail to open doors that had been welded shut for generations. She stopped beside Vesper, her eyes finding David Kane's name without hesitation. "He would be proud," Stone said simply. "Would he?" Vesper's voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, a current of doubt that she couldn't quite suppress. "You graduated top of your class from Scout Sniper School. You hold the base record for long-range cold bore accuracy. You survived Hello Week when 60% of the men didn't." Stone turned to face her. "You earned your place here, Sergeant. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Vesper nodded, but the weight of expectation pressed down on her shoulders like a physical thing. Every woman who came after her would be measured against her performance. One moment of weakness, one instance of failure that could be attributed to her gender, and the door would slam shut. Not just for her, but for all of them. "The integration program," Vespera asked. "Approved. You'll be embedded with SEAL Team 4 for operational evaluation. 6 months full combat deployment status." Stone's expression hardened. "I won't lie to you, Vespera. Commander Crawford isn't happy about this. He's old-school Gulf War veteran. Lost his entire team to friendly fire, and he's never forgotten it. He sees you as a liability." "I'll change his mind." "No," Stone said firmly. "You won't. Not with words. Men like Crawford only respect one thing: results. You want his trust, earn it. You want a seat at the table, take it. But understand that you'll have to rip every inch of ground from their hands." Stone reached into her jacket and pulled out a sealed envelope. "This is from your mother. She made me promise to give it to you today." Vespera took the envelope, feeling the weight of the paper. Her mother's handwriting was neat and precise across the front. For Vesper, when she needs to remember who she is. She opened it carefully. The letter was brief, but every word carried the weight of 25 years of love and worry. Vesper, your father told me the night before his last deployment that you would eclipse him. He said you had something he never had: the ability to see yourself clearly, to know your limits and then ignore them. He was right. I've watched you push past every barrier, overcome every doubt. Now prove him right. Show them what Cain blood means. Come home to me. Mom. Vespera folded the letter and slipped it into her breast pocket. She could feel it there, warm against her chest, a reminder of the weight she carried. Not just her own dreams, but the dreams of every woman who would come after her. Your flight leaves in 3 hours, Stone said. FO Neptune, 60 miles west of San Francisco. They're tracking a high-value target. The mission brief is classified until you arrive, but I can tell you this much: if it goes wrong, a lot of people are going to die. Vesper straightened her spine, finding that perfect military bearing that had been drilled into her through years of training. I won't let you down, ma'am. Don't do it for me, Stone replied. Do it for him. And for every woman who dreams of standing where you're standing now. The FOB Neptune was a collection of prefabricated buildings and shipping containers arranged on a rocky outcropping that barely qualified as an island. The helicopter flight from Coronado had taken 2 hours flying north along the California coast through increasingly heavy weather. Vespera could see storm clouds building on the western horizon, dark and pregnant with the promise of violence. She stepped off the MH-60 Seahawk into a world of salt spray and diesel fumes. The rotor wash whipped her uniform against her body as she grabbed her gear bag and rifle case. A young petty officer met her at the landing pad, his expression cycling through confusion and barely concealed skepticism as he took in her rank insignia and gender. Sergeant Cain, he shouted over the helicopter noise. That's me. I'm supposed to escort you to the TOC. Commander Crawford is waiting. The Tactical Operations Center was a climate-controlled container filled with monitors, communication equipment, and the kind of tense energy that preceded dangerous operations. 6 men stood around a central table covered with charts and satellite imagery. They all turned when Vespera entered, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Commander James Crawford stood at the head of the table, 58 years old, broad-shouldered, with a graying beard and pale blue eyes that had seen too much. He wore utilities with no rank insignia. Seals didn't advertise, but there was no mistaking his authority. When he spoke, other men listened. Sergeant Cain, he said, his voice deep and controlled. I'm Commander Crawford. This is my team. He gestured to the men around the table. Chief Petty Officer Mark Romano, the senior enlisted man built like a linebacker with arms that looked like they could bend steel. Petty Officer First Class Danny Torres, younger, but with the kind of 1,000-yard stare that came from too many deployments. The others introduced themselves: a communications specialist, medic breacher, all of them looking at Vespera with the same expression: polite professional skepticism. You're here as an observer, Crawford said without preamble. Command thinks integrating female Marines into NSFBAJ operations is the future. I think it's a political stunt that's going to get people killed. But I don't make policy, I execute missions. So you'll stay out of the way, observe, file your report, and then go back to whatever unit you came from. Clear. Crystal, sir. Good. Sit down. We have work to do. Vespera moved to a chair against the back wall, separated from the main table. She sat with her spine straight and her eyes forward, watching and learning. This was enemy territory, and she was outnumbered 6-1. Crawford activated an overhead projector, and a satellite image appeared on the screen. It showed a section of ocean northwest of the base, deep blue water marked with shipping lanes and depth contours. This is the Cordell Bank, Crawford said, pointing to an underwater ridge marked on the chart. 60 miles west of our position, deep water, strong currents, and normally nothing but commercial fishing boats. But 48 hours ago, our friends at the CIA intercepted some very interesting communications. He clicked to the next slide. A photograph appeared: a man in his 50s, pale, with the soft look of someone who spent his time in laboratories rather than gymnasiums. The image quality suggested it had been taken with a telephoto lens from a considerable distance. Dr. Dmitry Volkov, former biochemist for the Russian military, current freelancer for the highest bidder. For the past 5 years, he's been shopping his expertise to various terrorist organizations. Al-Qaeda, ISIS, domestic cells, anyone with enough money and sufficient motivation to kill large numbers of people. Crawford paused, letting that sink in. 3 days ago, Volkov went dark. No communications, no movement on any of his known accounts. Yesterday, we found out why. Another click. This time the image showed boats fast attack craft with modified hulls and oversized engines. Cigarette boats built for speed and violence. Volkov has been developing weaponized VX nerve agent. Not precursors, not components, the real thing. Refined, weaponized, ready for deployment. According to our intelligence, he's carrying enough concentrated VX to kill 100,000 people if deployed in an urban environment. The room went silent. VX was one of the most lethal chemical weapons ever created. A single drop on exposed skin could kill within minutes. Dispersed properly in a city, it would turn San Francisco into a graveyard. Original mission parameters were capture if possible, kill if necessary. Crawford continued. As of 6 hours ago, those parameters have changed. This is now strictly a termination operation. We sink the boats, we destroy the cargo, and we make sure nothing reaches the mainland. Chief Romano spoke up, his voice a gravelly rumble. Rules of engagement. Positive identification is mandatory, but once we have eyes on Volkov's convoy, we are weapons-free. Sink them all. How many boats? This from Torres. Intelligence says 6, fast attack, craft twin outboard configurations. They're waiting for a weather window to make their run toward shore. Crawford clicked to the next slide showing a weather map. Typhoon conditions are building off the coast. The storm is going to ground our air assets, no helicopters, no fixed wing support, no drone coverage. We're going in heavy, and we're going in alone. Insertion method, Romano again. Mark Vav SOC. We'll position ourselves along their projected route and interdict them in deep water, fast, violent, and final. Vespera studied the tactical display, her mind automatically running calculations. 6 boats in heavy weather, no air support engagement at sea in rough conditions. The Mark V was fast and lethal, but it wasn't designed for precision work in storm conditions. The team would have to get close and very close, which meant the enemy could return fire. She raised her hand. The room turned to look at her. Crawford's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in his eyes. Yes, Sergeant. Sir, without aerial ISR, you're going in blind. No real-time intelligence on convoy composition or exact position. You're assuming they'll follow predicted routes and maintain formation in heavy weather. Crawford's jaw tightened. That's correct, which is why we're bringing overwhelming firepower and superior tactics. With respect, sir, you need a force multiplier, someone who can provide early warning and precision fires from standoff range. And where exactly do you propose we find this asset in case you haven't noticed we're operating in open ocean? Vespera moved to the chart table, pointing to a small symbol northwest of their position. Point Reyes Lighthouse, decommissioned since 2005, but the structure is still intact. It sits on a submerged reef approximately 800 meters from the main shipping channel. With proper optics and the right weapon system, a shooter on that platform could cover the entire approach corridor. Crawford stared at the chart, then at her. That lighthouse has been abandoned for 20 years. The access ladder is probably rusted through. And in case you've forgotten, we're looking at 15-foot swells and 50-knot winds. Nobody's climbing that structure in these conditions. I could. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Chief Romano actually laughed a short, sharp bark of disbelief. Crawford stepped closer to her, using his height advantage. You could, Sergeant. That lighthouse is 3 miles from our insertion point. The water temperature is 68 degrees. The current runs at 4 knots. You put a human body in those conditions for more than 30 minutes, hypothermia becomes a factor. After an hour, most people are dead. Sir, I've studied the hydrographic charts. There's a rip current that forms off the southern reef during storm conditions. If I time my entry correctly, I don't fight the current, I use it. It becomes a conveyor belt that carries me directly to the base of the lighthouse. Torres shook his head. A rip current carries you out to sea, Sergeant. It doesn't deliver you to specific coordinates. Usually, yes, but the bathymetry here is unique. The channel narrows as it approaches the reef structure around the lighthouse. The current deflects off the underwater obstacles and creates an eddy zone. If I enter the rip at the correct point and angle, I get pulled into that eddy. From there, it's a short swim to the lighthouse. Crawford studied her face, looking for cracks for doubt, for any sign that she didn't fully comprehend what she was proposing. And if you miscalculate the entry point by even 100 meters, then I drown and you continue the mission without me. The silence that followed was absolute. These were men accustomed to risk, to making life and death calculations under pressure. But they were also men who looked out for each other, who brought everyone home. Crawford turned away from her. He looked at his team, reading their expressions. None of them wanted to be part of this conversation. No, he said finally. Absolutely not. I'm not sending you out there, and I'm sure as hell not explaining to Admiral Stone why I let a Marine sergeant drown on my watch. Then don't send me, sir. I volunteer. Log it as my independent initiative. That's not how this works, Sergeant. Vespera stepped closer to the table, her voice dropping but gaining intensity. Sir, you said yourself this is interdiction. The mission is to sink those boats and destroy that VX before it reaches populated areas. If I can provide precision fire support from an elevated position, I increase your probability of success. I'm offering you an asset. You're offering me a liability. I'm offering you a force multiplier with the range and accuracy to engage targets before they can effectively return fire. Use me or don't, but don't dismiss the option because you're worried about optics. Crawford's expression hardened. This has nothing to do with optics. This has to do with physics. You don't have the body mass to survive that swim. The ocean doesn't care about your qualification scores or your determination. It cares about thermal dynamics and hydrodynamics, and by every measurable standard, you are inadequate for this task. The word hit her like a physical blow. Inadequate. It was the same word she'd heard her entire career, the same dismissal that followed her through every school, every evaluation, every opportunity. Always the same conclusion, inadequate. But this time something was different. This time she didn't feel the familiar stab of self-doubt. Instead, she felt her father's dog tags against her chest warm from her body heat. She felt the weight of her mother's letter in her pocket. She felt the eyes of every woman who would come after her watching and waiting. I hold the base record for long-range open water swimming, she said quietly. 5 kilometers in 58 minutes, no fins, no wetsuit and water, 10 degrees colder than what we're facing tonight. I've trained in cold water immersion. I know the signs of hypothermia, and I know my limits. Then you know that 2 miles in storm conditions is beyond them. No, sir. 2 miles is challenging, but it's not impossible. Not if you want to complete this mission. Crawford stared at her for a long moment. Behind him, his team watched the exchange with uncomfortable fascination. This was their commander being challenged by an outsider, a woman, someone who had no business being here in the first place. The door to the T-Oak burst open. A man in civilian clothes rushed in, pale and sweating despite the air conditioning. He carried a tablet computer and had the harried look of someone bearing very bad news. Commander, we have updated intelligence. Priority flash. Crawford turned. What is it? We just intercepted new communications from Volkov's network. The chemical payload isn't just VX, it's a binary agent. 2 components that are harmless individually, but create a weaponized nerve agent when combined. And sir, he paused, swallowing hard. There are 7 boats, not 6, and they're not heading for San Francisco. Where? Los Angeles. They plan to deploy the agent during the evening rush hour. If they succeed, he looked down at his tablet as if the numbers were too terrible to speak aloud. Conservative estimates suggest 200,000 casualties in the first hour. The TOC went silent except for the hum of electronics and the distant sound of waves against the rocks below. 200,000 people. Families having dinner, children playing in parks, commuters heading home from work. All of them depending on 6 men and 1 woman to stand in the gap between them and annihilation. Crawford looked at the updated intelligence, then at the weather report, then at Vespera. For the first time since she'd walked into the room, she saw something other than dismissal in his eyes. She saw the cold calculation of a professional warrior weighing options and finding them all terrible. If I authorize this, he said slowly, and you get into trouble out there, I cannot come get you. Do you understand the Mark V will be committed to the primary engagement? We will not have the assets to mount a rescue. I understand, sir. If you start to drown, if you get hypothermic, if something goes wrong and you key that radio for help, I will not respond. I cannot respond. You will die alone in the dark, and the mission will continue without you. I understand. Crawford's step went closer, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. I lost my entire team in the Gulf because I put them in the wrong place at the wrong time. I have carried that weight for 30 years. I will not add your name to the list of people who died because I made a bad call. Then don't make a bad call, sir. Make the right one. Crawford searched her face one last time, looking for any sign that she didn't fully comprehend what she was volunteering for. He found nothing but cold determination and the kind of stubborn courage that separated warriors from soldiers. You have 10 minutes to gear up, he said. If you're late, we leave without you. If you fall behind during the transit, we will not stop. If you fail to reach the lighthouse, the mission continues. You are expendable. Is that clear? Crystal, sir. Then get moving, Sergeant. And Kane. She turned back toward him. Your father would be proud. Vespera felt something tighten in her chest, but she didn't let it show on her face. Thank you, sir. She turned and walked out of the TOC into the storm. Part 2. Storm and Steel. Vespera's gear was already staged in the small container that served as temporary quarters. She had packed light because she knew weight would kill her in the water. Now she spread everything on the narrow cot and began the careful process of selecting what would keep her alive and what would drag her to the bottom. The Mk-13 Mod 7 sniper rifle was the heart of the operation. 7.5 pounds of precision machinery chambered in .300 Winchester Magnum, effective to 200 meters in ideal conditions. She wouldn't have ideal conditions. She'd be lucky to get reliable hits at 800 meters in a storm. The rifle went into a waterproof Pelican case rated for submersion to 100 meters. It would float barely but enough to keep the weapon from sinking if she lost her grip. She checked the pressure relief valve, twice tested the latches, and secured the case with marine-grade padding. Ammunition, 5 magazines, 5 rounds each. 25 rounds total to stop 7 boats carrying enough poison to kill 250,000 people. Each magazine went into a separate waterproof bag. Redundancy. If one failed, she still had 4 others. The AN-PVS-27 thermal weapon sight would turn her scope into something that could see through rain and darkness, painting heat signatures in green phosphor against the black night. Battery life was 6 hours. She packed 2 spares. Everything went into a waterproof drag bag, rifle case, ammunition, optics, emergency beacon, first aid kit, energy bars. She probably wouldn't have time to eat. She pulled the drawstring tight, sealed the roll-top closure, and attached a 3-meter tow line to her harness. If she had to cut the bag loose, she could do it in seconds. The wetsuit was 5mm neoprene, thicker than she preferred, but necessary for thermal protection. She stripped down to her underwear and pulled the soot on the rubber tight and restrictive against her skin. It would trap a layer of water against her body and use her body heat to warm it. As long as she kept moving, it would work. If she stopped, the water would cool and the suit would become a refrigerator. Over the wetsuit, she pulled on lightweight tactical clothing. It wouldn't provide much additional warmth, but it would protect the neoprene from abrasion during the climb up the lighthouse. Pockets loaded with carabiners, rope, a knife, chemical light, sticks, everything she might need if the plan went sideways. The climbing harness was rated for 2,000 pounds. She clipped it around her waist and legs, adjusting the straps until it fit snug. The drag bag tow line attached to a locking carabiner on the front of the harness. She tested the connection, pulling hard enough to lift her own weight. Solid. She looked at herself in the small mirror mounted on the container wall. A small woman in a wetsuit and tactical gear. 125 pounds, 5'4" brown hair, pulled back in a tight bun. Inadequate, that's what Crawford had called her. Physics didn't care about determination. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her father's dog tags. The metal was cool against her palm, worn smooth by decades of service. She held them for a moment, feeling the weight, then slipped the chain over her head. The tags settled against her chest under the wetsuit against her skin. From her breast pocket, she pulled out her mother's letter. She read it one more time. Your father told me you would eclipse him. He said you had something. He never had the ability to see yourself clearly, to know your limits, and then ignore them. He was right. Now prove him right. She folded the letter carefully and tucked it into a waterproof pouch in her chest pocket. I'm coming home, Mom, she whispered to the empty container. But not yet. Bah. The Mark V Special Operations craft was a beast. 82 feet of Kevlar-reinforced hull powered by twin MTU diesel engines that could push the vessel to 50 knots in calm seas. In a storm, it was a missile that bounced and crashed and punished everyone aboard. Vespera climbed aboard and took her assigned position near the stern. The crew was already in place, Crawford at the helm, conferring with the coxswain Romano checking weapons, Torres securing equipment. The weather had worsened in the 30 minutes she'd spent gearing up. Rain lashed the deck in horizontal sheets, and the wind was building toward gale force. Nobody looked at her. Nobody spoke to her. She was a ghost, an unwanted variable in a finely tuned equation. She strapped herself into the shock-absorbing seat and placed the drag bag between her feet, running an extra carabiner through the deck webbing. Double secured. If the boat rolled, the pain stayed with the boat. If the boat sank, she could cut it loose in seconds. The engines roared to life. The sound was overwhelming even through hearing protection. The deck vibrated with barely contained power. The smell of diesel exhaust mixed with salt spray and the metallic tang of approaching storm. Crawford's voice came over the internal communication system. Listen up. We are departing in 2 minutes. Weather update: sea state is now 6, very rough. Winds gusting to 50 knots, visibility less than 100 meters. Air assets remain grounded. We are alone out there. He paused, and Vespera could hear the weight of command in his voice. We run dark, we run silent, and we complete the mission. Questions? Silence. Good. Romano status. All personnel accounted for, weapons hot, ready to deploy. Torres. Comms check complete. Satellite link is marginal due to weather but functional. Outstanding. Kane. Vesper keyed her mic. Ready, sir. Remember, once you hit the water, you're on your own. No rescue, no support. You make it or you don't. Understood. Good luck. The Mark V pulled away from the pier. The moment it cleared the breakwater, the ocean grabbed it. A 12-foot swell lifted the bow, held it suspended for a sickening moment, then dropped it into the trough. The impact was like hitting concrete. The hull shuddered, equipment rattled, and men grunted against their restraints. Vespera closed her eyes and focused on her breathing. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. The same pattern she used for precision, shooting the same rhythm that slowed her heart rate and calmed her nervous system. The boat climbed another swell, dropped again, climbed, dropped. The pattern was relentless. After 10 minutes, she saw Romano turn green. Even elite operators got seasick. The body didn't care about training. Physics was physics. She felt nausea rise in her own throat, bile and adrenaline. She swallowed it down and focused on a fixed point on the deck. Don't look at the horizon. The horizon was a lie in weather like this. Just breathe. The coxswain's voice crackled over the comm. Skipper, radar is cluttered. Rain return is too heavy. I can't differentiate targets from interference. Keep pushing, Crawford ordered. We have a time on target. If we miss the window, Volkov escapes. The boat surged forward, blind in the storm. 20 minutes passed. 30. The violence didn't decrease. If anything, it got worse. The swells were 18 feet now, steep and breaking. The boat climbed each wave at a 40-degree angle, hung at the top, then crashed down the backside. Suddenly, a grinding, tearing noise vibrated through the deck plates and up into Vespera's bones. It was the sound of metal being destroyed. The starboard engine screamed in protest, high-pitched and dying, then cut out completely. Before anyone could react, the port engine seized. The violent forward momentum vanished. The boat lost power and wallowed in the trough of a swell beam onto the waves. Status? Crawford's voice cut through the chaos. The engineer's reply was panicked. Both engines down. We must have sucked up debris, fishing net, or kelp. Cooling intakes or clogged engines overheated. We're dead stick. A massive swell hit them, beam on, rolling the Mark V nearly 60 degrees. Equipment cases slid across the deck. Men grabbed for handholds. Vesper slammed against the bulkhead, but held onto the webbing of her drag bag. The boat righted itself, but the danger was immediate and obvious. Without engines, they had no control. The ocean would take them wherever it wanted. Restart them, Crawford commanded. I can't, sir. Not without manually clearing the intakes. In this sea state, that's a 2-hour job minimum. Crawford slammed his fist against the console. They were 3 miles from target, with the convoy scheduled to pass through the intercept zone in 90 minutes. They couldn't drift. We could try to make emergency repairs, Romano suggested. Current's pushing us south, Vesper said quietly. All eyes turned to her. She unclipped from her seat and pulled a laminated tide chart from her thigh pocket, spreading it on the deck and holding it flat against the boat's violent motion. We're in the dead zone. Current here flows southwest at approximately 3 knots. If we drift for 20 minutes, we'll be 4 miles from the target area, too far for any kind of meaningful engagement. Crawford stared at the chart. So the mission is scrubbed? No, sir, the mission adapts. Explain. Vesper pointed to the chart. If we deploy a sea anchor to stabilize our heading, we can control our drift angle. The dead zone current will push us south, yes, but we're close to the edge of the rip current I mentioned earlier. If we drift for approximately 20 minutes at our current rate, we enter the rip. At that point, current accelerates to 6 knots and shifts direction to northeast. We get pulled directly toward the lighthouse area. And then what? Romano asked. We wave at them as they drive past. Then I'm 2 miles from the lighthouse instead of 3, and 2 miles is swimmable. The cabin went silent, except for the sound of the storm battering the hull. Torres actually laughed a bitter, disbelieving sound. You're talking about suicide, Crawford said. I'm talking about the mission. And right now, I'm the only asset you have that can still reach the objective. These were men accustomed to solving problems with violence and speed and overwhelming force. They were not used to being helpless, to having their expensive equipment fail them when it mattered most. Crawford looked at the GPS display, then at the weather radar, then at Vespera. 2 miles, in open ocean, at night, in a storm. That's your plan. It's the only plan that keeps the mission alive. He shook his head slowly. This is exactly what I was afraid of. You're trying to prove something. You are trying to be the hero, and you're going to get yourself killed. I'm trying to complete the mission, sir, that's all. Crawford leaned forward, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper that only she could hear. If you go out there, Vespera, you are completely alone. No communication relay until you reach the lighthouse. No extraction if you cramp up. No rescue if you get into trouble. Do you understand what I'm telling you? If you start to drown, do not key that radio. Do not call for help. Because I will not come and I will not have my men listening to you die. The words were brutal, pragmatic, the kind of calculation that separated operators from soldiers. Vespera held his gaze steadily. I understand, sir. Do you? Because once you go over that rail, you're not part of this team anymore. You're just a body in the water. And if you fail, if you drown out there, I have to write a report explaining why I let you go. I have to tell Admiral Stone that I sent her protege to die. Can you live with that responsibility? Can you live with letting Volkov escape? The question hung in the air. Crawford straightened, looked at his team. They were watching, waiting for his decision. The boat pitched violently, reminding them all that time was running out. Fine, he said, his voice tight with reluctance. You have green light, but I'm logging this as your initiative, your choice. If you die, it's not on my command. Understood. Vespera didn't waste a second. She knelt on the pitching deck and began stripping off her gear. The tactical clothing came off, revealing the wetsuit beneath. She kept her harness, her knife, the bare essentials. She opened the drag bag and checked the rifle case one more time, verified that all seals were tight. The seals watched her preparation with the morbid fascination of men watching someone prepare for their own execution. She was methodical, precise, checking each piece of equipment twice. Romano walked over and held out a small infrared strobe light. If you actually make it, he said, if you secure the position and get set up, blink this. We'll try to get the engines running. Maybe we can come pick up what's left of you. Vespera clipped the strobe to her harness. I'll light it when the targets are down, Chief. She moved to the rear deck. The engineer opened the hatch, and the full fury of the storm flooded the cabin instantly. Rain lashed in, soaking everything within seconds. Beyond the rail, the ocean looked like a living thing, black, violent, hungry. Vespera looked out at the void. The waves were towering walls of water. There was no horizon, no light, nothing but chaos and darkness and the promise of death. Behind her, she heard Torres mutter, 2 miles. She's going to turn back in 5 minutes. Vespera pulled her mask down over her eyes and bit down on her snorkel mouthpiece. She sat on the gunwale and timed the rise and fall of the swells, waiting for the perfect moment. She didn't look back at them. She didn't say goodbye. She rolled backward into the abyss. Tab. The water hit her like a physical blow. The cold was absolute, not the pleasant shock of jumping into a swimming pool on a hot day, but something darker, more primal. The water was 68 degrees, which sounded warm until you realized that anything below 98.6 was a thief. It stole heat, stole energy, stole time. Vespera plunged 15 feet down, the momentum of her entry driving her deep into the black. The transition from air to water was violent. One moment there was the roar of wind and engines and shouting men. The next there was only the crushing, muffled roar of turbulence. Her equilibrium spun wildly. Up was down, left was right. The darkness was total. Panic flared in her chest, the lizard brain screaming its ancient warning. Drowning. Dying. Get to the surface. She kicked hard, her fins biting into the water. She broke the surface, gasping, and immediately a wave slapped her in the face, forcing a mouthful of brine down her throat. She gagged, spat out the vile mixture. Her eyes stung despite the mask. The Mark V was a dark shape looming above her, pitching violently in the swell. The steel hull groaned as it slammed down into the trough, sending shockwaves of displaced water that shoved Vespera backward like an invisible hand. The drag bag. Where was the drag bag? She reached behind her, fumbling for the tow line. The bag was there, bobbing heavily, 5 feet behind her, jerking at her waist harness with every wave. A thin yellow safety line still connected her to the boat protocol, dictated that you never detach until stable in the water. But the boat was drifting south, dragging her with it, fighting against the very current she needed to catch. The line went taut, jerking her violently toward the hull. She could see the massive outboard engines rising and falling like guillotines just yards away. She reached for the dive knife strapped to her thigh, 7 inches of steel razor sharp. The safety line was thick nylon designed to hold a man in heavy seas. A voice shouted from above Ashford, she thought, though the wind made it impossible to be sure. It sounded small and desperate against the ocean's roar. She didn't hesitate. She slashed the line in one fluid motion. The tension snapped. The connection to the world of men and safety and backup was severed. She was instantly swept away from the hull by the receding swell. The boat's spotlight swept over her one last time, illuminating her white-knuckle grip on the knife, then lost her in the darkness. She was alone. The darkness was absolute. The sky was a heavy blanket of storm clouds that blocked out moon and stars. The ocean was a black void that seemed to extend infinitely in all directions. Without a horizon, vertigo set in immediately. She felt like she was falling through space. Vespera rolled onto her back, forcing her breathing to slow. In, out, in, out. She checked her wrist compass. The glowing radium dial was a faint green eye in the dark. Northeast 045 degrees. She kicked experimentally, testing the weight of the drag bag. It was heavy, a dead weight pulling at her hips, threatening to flip her over. She had to find the rhythm. Kick, glide, wait for the tug kick again. If she fought the bag, she'd burn out in 10 minutes. She had to let it follow her, not drag it. She put her face in the water and started the stroke. Combat side stroke, the most efficient method for covering distance while conserving energy. Left arm extended, right arm, pulled legs kicked in a scissoring flutter. The motion was mechanical, repetitive, almost hypnotic. The water around her was alive with bioluminescence, tiny sparks of green light that flared with every movement of her fins. It was beautiful and terrifying. It meant everything she did was visible to anything looking up from the depths. A large swell lifted her up, then dropped her into a trough so deep the wind cut out completely. For a few seconds in the valley between waves, there was an eerie quiet, just the slosh of water and the sound of her own heart hammering in her ears. She thought of the SEALs in the cabin of the Mark V. They were probably shaking their heads right now, betting on how long she'd last. Torres had probably given her 5 minutes. Romano, maybe 10. Crawford wouldn't bet at all. He'd just wait for the radio call that never came. They thought she was trying to prove something to them. They were wrong. She wasn't swimming for their respect. She was swimming because the math said it was possible and the mission said it was necessary. But the math hadn't accounted for the loneliness. It was crushing, suffocating. There was no radio chatter, no engine hum, no human sounds at all. Just the infinite black and the knowledge that she was a single point of heat in a cold, indifferent ocean. A speck of defiance in a universe that didn't care whether she lived or died. A piece of kelp brushed against her cheek, slimy and cold. She nearly screamed, her hand jerking toward her knife before rational thought reasserted itself. It was just seaweed debris torn from the bottom by the storm. She forced herself to visualize the destination, the lighthouse, the rusted iron stairs, the shooting platform at the top. She built the image in her mind brick by brick, using it as a focal point to keep the panic at bay. The current was changing. She could feel it in the way the water moved beneath her, the way the waves took on a different rhythm. The chaotic surface chop was smoothing out into long, muscular undulations. It felt less like waves and more like the breathing of some massive creature. The rip current had her. She wasn't drifting anymore. She was being pulled. She could feel the water grab her legs and accelerate her forward. The drag bag behind her was humming now, the nylon straps vibrating against her wetsuit like guitar strings under tension. She was moving fast. Too fast. The calculations had predicted 4 knots, maybe 5. This felt like 6 or more. The storm surge had supercharged the current system, turning the ocean into a horizontal waterfall. Vespera switched her stroke pattern, angling across the flow, rather than fighting it directly. She had to let the vector math do the work. Fighting the current would burn glycogen in minutes. She had to ride it like a kayaker crossing a river, using the energy rather than wasting her own. The debris field hit her without warning. Something hard slammed into her left shoulder, a coconut or a piece of driftwood. The impact was solid enough to numb her entire arm. Before she could recover, a heavy, sodden weight draped over her head. It smelled of rot and dead fish. Ghost net, commercial fishing gear lost or abandoned at sea, monofilament and nylon mesh designed to catch anything that swam. Panic spiked in her chest, sharp, electric primal. The net snagged on her snorkel, then her harness. The drag bag behind her caught in a tangle of mesh, and suddenly she was anchored. The current didn't stop, but she did. Water piled up behind her, driving her under. She was being keel-hauled by the ocean itself. Vespera thrashed, but the net was everywhere, slippery and impossible to grip. She was 5 feet under, then 10. The pressure built in her ears. The regulator was ripped from her mouth, and she swallowed a lungful of seawater. Darkness, spinning, drowning. For a split second, she wasn't in the Pacific. She was back in the pool, at Coronado, hands and feet-bound, lungs burning at the bottom of the deep end. The instructors were watching from the deck, impassive and clinical. "Don't struggle," they had said. "Panic burns oxygen. Accept the water. Be the water." The lesson wasn't about swimming. It was about dying gracefully until you found a way to live. Vespera stopped thrashing. She went limp in the grip of the net. The current tumbled her, but by relaxing, she created slack. She felt the mesh loosen around her neck. Her hand found the knife hilt. She didn't slash wildly. She located the tension point near her waist harness and sawed methodically. One stroke, two. The nylon parted with a dull snap. She kicked upward, bursting through the surface, gasping for air that was half water and half spray. She coughed violently, expelling brine. Her throat was raw, her vision blurred. But she was free. She checked her gear quickly. Rifle case still attached, fins still on, knife in hand. She looked at her left wrist. The Garmin GPS watch was gone, sheared off by the net. The screen that was her only way of knowing exactly how far she'd drifted was now at the bottom of the ocean. She was flying blind. No GPS, no visual references, just a compass and a mental clock that had been interrupted by near drowning. She had to trust her navigation skills and pray that her calculations had been correct. How long had she been under? 30 seconds a minute. She'd been swimming for maybe 40 minutes before hitting the net, 50 now. The lighthouse should be close, had to be close. If she'd miscalculated, if she'd missed the eddy zone or entered the current at the wrong angle, she would overshoot the lighthouse entirely. The current would carry her into the open Pacific, where the swells were 30 feet high and no ship would ever find her. Vespera put her face back in the water and resumed the stroke. She couldn't think about the void waiting for her if she failed. She had to kick, had to trust the math, had to believe that physics and skill and desperate determination would be enough. The current was slowing now, the violent rushing water spreading out as it reached deeper ocean. She should have felt relief, but as the turbulence faded, a new and heavier silence pressed in around her. She was entering the deep channel, the section of ocean that local fishermen avoided, the place where nutrient-rich runoff from the California coast met the open Pacific. It attracted bait fish, which attracted the predators. Great whites, tiger sharks, blue sharks, the apex predators of the eastern Pacific, all of them perfectly adapted for hunting in exactly these conditions. Vespera knew the statistics. The probability of attack was low. Humans weren't preferred prey. Most shark encounters were investigative, a bump, a taste, then they moved on. But statistics meant nothing when you were a solitary, warm-blooded seal-shaped object kicking frantically on the surface of a pitch-black ocean. She stopped kicking and let momentum carry her forward. Splash discipline was paramount now. Every disturbance was a dinner bell, every ripple an advertisement that something edible was struggling on the surface. She thought about the bull shark's hunting technique, the investigative bump before the bite. She thought about the great white's ability to detect the electrical impulses of a beating heart from hundreds of meters away. She thought about her exposed face and hands glowing like beacons in the thermal vision of a predator designed to hunt in exactly these conditions. The water here felt different, older, colder. The bioluminescence had faded. The void was so complete she couldn't tell if her eyes were open or closed. Then something touched her. It wasn't the drift of current or the brush of kelp. It was solid, deliberate. It brushed against her left thigh, starting at the knee and sliding up to her hip. It was heavy, the texture rough like wet sandpaper. Powerful enough to knock her slightly off axis. Vespera froze. Every muscle in her body locked in rigid terror. Contact left side. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat she felt sure was echoing through the water like sonar. She knew about the ampullae of Lorenzini, the electroreceptors in a shark's snout. that could detect the electrical impulses of a beating heart from vast distances. Every time her heart beat, she was sending out a signal. Here I am, here I am, here I am. She forced herself to go limp, drifting with the swell. If she thrashed, she triggered the predatory response prey behavior. If she played dead, maybe it would lose interest. She floated there, suspended in the black, waiting for the strike. She imagined the water displacing as the mouth opened. She imagined the rows of serrated teeth that tearing the darkness. The waiting was worse than contact. A minute passed, then two. Nothing. The water around her remained still. Had it been a current eddy? A hallucination brought on by sensory deprivation and oxygen debt? She rotated her head slowly to the left, moving with glacial care. She couldn't use her light. A beam in this water would illuminate her position to anyone on the surface and attract every predator in the area. Then she felt it again, a solid impact on the drag bag trailing behind her. The bag jerked violently, nearly pulling her under. Vespera spun in the water, bringing the knife up her legs, pulling beneath her to protect her femoral arteries. Her fingers brushed against something solid. Not skin or cartilage, but wood waterlogged, rotting driftwood. A massive piece of timber, probably torn from the coast by the storm surge, floating vertically in the water like a dead sentinel. The rough texture had been bark. The impact had been the drag bag snagging on a branch. Vespera exhaled slowly, a stream of bubbles rushing past her ears. The relief was so intense it was almost painful. Her muscles, which had been coiled like springs, turned to liquid. She wasn't going to be eaten. It was just debris. But as she pushed away from the log, untangling the tow line with shaking fingers, she realized the cost of that terror. The adrenaline dump had been massive. Her body had emptied its reserves of glucose to fuel a fight that never came. Now the crash was coming. Her arms felt heavy leaden. The cold, which she'd managed to ignore during the panic, came rushing back with renewed vengeance. Her teeth began to chatter around the mouthpiece of her snorkel, an uncontrollable clacking sound. Hypothermia, stage 1. She was burning fuel too fast. The fear had cost her warmth, and warmth was time, and time was distance, and distance was survival. Vespera forced her legs to move. The kick was weaker now, less precise. The rhythm was broken, but she kept going because stopping meant sinking, and sinking meant dying. And dying meant that 200,000 people in Los Angeles would pay the price for her failure. Time became elastic. Minutes stretched into hours, or maybe hours compressed into minutes. She had no way to know. The swim became an endless loop of sensation: kick, glide, breathe, kick, glide, breathe. The mantra of survival repeated until it lost all meaning. The cold crept deeper into her core. The shivering intensified, then suddenly stopped. That wasn't relief, that was the lie her body told her when it was preparing to die. The cessation of shivering wasn't recovery, it was surrender. Her body was shutting down heat production to preserve her vital organs. Everything else was expendable. Then her right calf cramped. The pain was blinding, absolute. It felt like her fibula had shattered. The muscle twisted into a knot so tight it doubled her over in the water. Her legs seized into a rigid, useless anchor. She gasped, inhaled spray, choked. The drag bag, no longer pulled by forward momentum, drifted into her back and pushed her face underwater. She thrashed, trying to massage the cramp through the thick neoprene, but her hands were clumsy, devoid of sensation. "Let go," a voice whispered. "Just stop kicking. It's warm down there." The water did feel warm. It felt like a bath. It was the most seductive sensation she'd ever experienced, the illusion of comfort as her capillaries dilated in a final fatal error. Her brain was telling her she was overheating when she was actually freezing to death. Vespera drifted, eyes closed. The darkness behind her eyelids was brighter than the ocean. She was sinking. "I told you, didn't I?" The voice was clear, cutting through the roar of the storm. It wasn't inside her head, it was right next to her ear. Vespera opened her eyes. Treading water beside her, dry and perfectly pressed in his marine dress blues, was her father. David Kane looked exactly as he had in the photograph on her nightstand, young, strong, invincible. He was walking on the water, looking down at her with an expression of profound disappointment. "Biology, Vesper," the Phantom said, checking his watch. "It's just biology. You don't have the bone density. You don't have the thermal mass. You're just a little girl playing dress-up in a man's ocean." Vespera blinked. She knew he wasn't there. She knew it was synapses misfiring in a hypothermic brain, hallucinations born of oxygen deprivation and cellular shutdown. But the hatred she felt for that tone of voice was real, pure, distilled rage. "Look at you," the phantom sneered, "curled up like a shrimp. You going to cry? You going to ring the bell? Go ahead, ring it." Crawford's waiting to say, "I told you so." The whole Navy's waiting. Ring the bell. Something snapped in her chest. It wasn't energy. She had no energy left. It was spite. Pure, molten rage at being dismissed, at being told she wasn't good enough, at being written off because of her size and gender. "No," she gargled through the mouthpiece. She grabbed her cramped leg with both hands and forced the foot to flex manually, tearing the muscle fibers apart to release the knot. The pain was nauseating white hot, but it cut through the hypothermic fog like a flare. "I don't quit," she hissed. The phantom shimmered and vanished into sea foam. Vespera rolled onto her stomach. Her right leg was useless, a dead weight dragging behind her. She would have to swim with one leg and her arms. It was inefficient, agonizing. But she was awake now. The rage had burned through the chemical fog in her brain. She dug her hands into the water, pulling with her lats, dragging her broken body through the heavy swells. She visualized Crawford's dismissive face, Romano's doubt, Torres's smirk. She used their skepticism as fuel to keep her core burning just a few degrees warmer, just a few minutes longer. 10 minutes later, or maybe an hour, time had no meaning. The darkness ahead of her shifted. It wasn't light. It was an absence of stars, a solid vertical shadow blacker than the sky. It rose from the churning water like a tombstone. The lighthouse, Point Reyes lighted station, decommissioned since 2005, was a jagged skeleton of iron and concrete leaning precariously on its submerged reef. Waves crashed against its base with tremendous force, sending geysers of white spray 50 feet into the air. The sound was deafening, the ocean trying to pulverize the structure that had defied it for more than a century. It was the ugliest thing Vespera had ever seen. It was beautiful. She had made it across the void. She had survived the predators and the cold and her own failing body. But now came the hardest part, catching a wet, barnacle-encrusted ladder on a moving target while the Pacific tried to crush her against it. She took a deep breath, timed the swell pattern, and kicked hard with her good leg. One last push. Part 3, Ghost in the Storm. The base of the lighthouse was a kill zone. The concrete foundation, a massive hexagonal block rising from the submerged reef, acted as a breakwater for swells that had traveled unchecked across hundreds of miles of Pacific Ocean. The incoming waves didn't just break against it, they exploded upward, turning the space around the access ladder into a chaotic washing machine of foam and crushing pressure. Vespera treaded water 30 feet out, timing the violence. Surge, smash, recede. Surge, smash, recede. She had one shot. If she mistimed the approach, the wave would slam her against the barnacle-encrusted pilings, shredding her wetsuit and the skin beneath like cheese against a grater. If she hesitated, the backwash would drag her into the jagged rocks below the waterline. She watched the rhythm, feeling the pattern in her bones. A massive swell rolled in, lifting her 20 feet as it crested and began its assault on the concrete. As it smashed against the foundation, she kicked hard, riding the forward momentum of the trough that followed. She hit the rusted iron ladder with jarring impact. Her hands' numb claws, devoid of feeling, slapped against the vertical rails. She didn't feel the metal. She only knew she was holding on because her arms stopped moving. She hooked her good leg through a lower rung, locking herself in place just as the water receded. Gravity returned with vengeance. The drag bag, heavy with absorbed seawater, became a 70-pound anchor, yanking her hips downward. Her shoulders screamed as the joints popped audibly under the strain. "Move," she grunted, the sound wet and primal. She couldn't climb with the bag swinging freely. The wind was gusting at 50 knots, and the case was acting like a pendulum that threatened to peel her off the iron framework. With shaking fingers, she unclipped the bag from her waist harness and used a short length of rope to secure it to her belt. It gave her 3 feet of slack, enough to manage the weight while still keeping the rifle close. She began the climb. The ladder was a nightmare of corrosion. Decades of salt spray had eaten away the iron, leaving the rungs pitted and flaking. Thick, slimy algae coated every surface. Vespera couldn't rely on grip strength. She had none left. She had to hook her elbows over the rungs and haul herself up with her lats and biceps dragging her paralyzed right leg behind her. 20 feet up. 30. The spray was still lashing her boots, but she was above the worst of it now. She stopped to rest, tying a safety line around the vertical rail. It was a friction hitch that would slide up as she climbed, but lock if she fell, her only insurance against the 70-foot drop to the rocks below. She reached for the next rung. It looked solid enough, thick with rust scales but intact. She transferred her weight to it, pulling her body upward. The metal crumbled under her grip. There was no warning. The iron rung, eaten through from the inside by decades of corrosion, simply disintegrated. She plummeted, her left hand snatching blindly at empty air. Her right arm hooked through a lower rung and took the full force of her falling body weight plus the rifle case. Her shoulder wrenched violently, a tearing sensation that ripped through her deltoid. She slammed into the ladder structure, her chest impacting the vertical rail. The air left her lungs in a wheezing gasp. The safety line bit into the rail and arrested her fall with a jerk that nearly snapped her spine. She hung there, dangling by one arm and a rope suspended 70 feet above the churning, white water below. The rifle case swung wildly beneath her, banging against the concrete shaft of the lighthouse, like a metronome of doom. She looked down. The foam swirled in the darkness, waiting. It would be easy to unclip the carabiner, to just let go. The swim had been impossible. The climb was impossible. She had done enough. No one could say she hadn't tried. Then the wind shifted, carrying a scent down from the platform above. It wasn't just the metallic tang of the storm. It was the acrid ammonia stink of bird guano. Life. There was solid ground up there. A low primal growl rose in her throat. She swung her legs, ignoring the agony in her cramped calf, and managed to hook her boot onto a crossbar. She pushed with everything she had left, driving her body upward past the broken rung. 3 more rungs, 2, 1. The ladder terminated at a metal grating, the maintenance catwalk that ringed the lighthouse's lantern room. Vespera threw her upper body over the edge, the metal mesh biting into her chest. It was cold and hard and real. It was the most beautiful feeling in the world. She scrambled forward, dragging the rifle case, until she was fully on the platform. She rolled onto her back, staring up at the dark glass of the lighthouse lens. Rain hammered her face. Her chest heaved in spasmodic gasps. She was bleeding from her hands, her shoulders, her shins. She was hypothermic and exhausted, but she wasn't in the water. The discipline that had been drilled into her through years of training reasserted itself. Not finished yet. Check the gun. She forced herself to sit up, the world tilting and spinning around her. She grabbed the railing to steady herself and reached for the case with trembling fingers. She had to know if the seals had failed, if the rifle was flooded, if the optics were fogged. She ripped the case open. Inside, nestled in high-density foam, the Mk13 Mod 7 was bone dry. The matte black finish absorbed what little ambient light there was, making it look like a hole cut in reality. It looked lethal. It looked perfect. Vespera slumped back against the lighthouse wall, hugging the rifle case to her chest. A single shivering laugh escaped her lips. She had the high ground. The catwalk was a grid of rusted steel suspended 80 feet above the Pacific, exposed to the full fury of the storm. There was no cover. The wind whipped around the cylindrical tower, accelerating as it curved and creating a vortex that threatened to peel her off the grating. She tried to stand. Her legs buckled. She crawled instead, dragging the rifle case toward the leeward side of the platform, seeking a few inches of shelter behind the lantern room's concrete base. She unzipped the case fully. Her hands were clumsy, shaking so violently she could hear the bones rattling. The Mk13 was a precision instrument built to kill at 1-200 meters, but it required a stable platform. Right now, Vespera was anything but stable. She tried to deploy the bipod legs. Her thumb slipped off the release button. She tried again, slipped again. A frustrated cry escaped her lips as she slammed her palm against the mechanism, forcing the legs down through brute force. She pulled the bolt back to check the chamber. The metallic clack was reassuring familiar. But when she tried to shoulder the weapon, the reticle in the scope danced wildly. She wasn't just shaking, she was convulsing. The crosshairs were jumping 3 meters off target at 100 meters. At 800, she wouldn't even hit the water, let alone an engine block. Hypothermia, stage 2 loss of fine motor control. She was freezing to death inside her own gear. The wetsuit, designed to keep her warm in the water by trapping a layer of liquid against her skin, was now a death trap. In the wind, the water was evaporating rapidly, sucking the remaining heat from her core like a vacuum. She was wearing a refrigerator. Vespera looked down at her chest. She knew what she had to do, and the thought alone made her whimper. But if she didn't get warm, if she didn't stop the violent shivering, she wouldn't be able to hit anything. "Do it!" she hissed through gritted teeth. She dropped the rifle and unzipped the wetsuit top, peeling it down over her shoulders. The wind hit her wet skin like liquid nitrogen. The pain was shocking, instantaneous, absolute. It felt like being flayed alive. She gritted her teeth so hard she felt a molar crack. She fought the urge to curl into a fetal ball and continued stripping the wetsuit down to her waist. She grabbed a microfiber towel from the rifle case and scrubbed her skin, frantically removing the salt and moisture. The friction generated a tiny, precious spark of heat. She threw the wet neoprene top aside, useless now, and wrapped herself in the thin emergency blanket from her kit. Then she pulled a lightweight shooting smock over her head. It was minimal protection, but it was windproof and dry. The difference was immediate. The evaporative cooling stopped. Her body heat began to circulate again. The violent convulsions slowed to a manageable rhythmic shivering. She picked up the rifle again. She was still shaking, but it was a vibration time could work with. She crawled to the railing, set up her shooting position. The convoy would be coming from the south, entering the shipping channel, where it narrowed to 800 meters wide. She needed a stable rest for the rifle. From her case, she pulled out a compact tripod with a hog saddle clamp. She set it up with the legs low and wide, jamming the rubber feet into the gaps in the metal grating to anchor it against the wind. She clamped the rifle into the saddle solid and stable. She pressed her eye to the scope and flipped the lever on the thermal sight mounted in front of her day scope. The world exploded into green. The image was grainy due to the storm, but the thermal vision cut through the rain like a knife. She scanned the channel. The water was a turbulent landscape of shifting grays and whites. The waves crashing against rocks showed up as spectral fire, brilliant white against the dark background. Distance to channel center, 820 meters. Wind full value left to right gusting 25 to 40 mph. The wind call was a nightmare. A 300 Winchester Magnum bullet would be pushed nearly 4 feet off target at this distance in this wind. She dialed windage into the scope's turret, the clicks audible and crisp over the storm. It was an educated guess based on the feel of wind against her cheek. She'd have to adjust on the fly. She settled in behind the gun, wrapping her legs around the tripod legs and loading the bipod with her body weight. The rifle was steady now. The tripod absorbed most of the vibration from her shivering body. She was no longer Vespericane half-drowned Marine, clinging to a rusted platform. She was a weapon system. She was the final checkpoint between Los Angeles and 200,000 corpses. She waited. Not. 10 minutes passed. The rain soaked her hair and plastered it to her skull. Despite the emergency blanket, the cold crept back into her fingers. Then she saw them. On the southern horizon, visible through the green phosphor of the thermal scope, a cluster of heat signatures emerged from the storm. They were faint at first, just smudges of white against the gray background, but they grew brighter and hotter as they approached. Boats, fast movers. They were in tight formation, plowing through the heavy swells, their exhaust stacks glowing like white-hot coals in the thermal vision. Vespera adjusted the focus, counting carefully. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 boats. Intelligence failure. Her heart rate spiked, then she controlled it through breathing discipline. 7 boats meant 14 engines. She had 25 rounds. That left a margin of error of exactly 11 shots. She dialed the focus knob and studied the lead vessel. Through the green haze, she could see the distinct heat signature of a pintle-mounted heavy machine gun on the bow. The barrel was warm. They'd been test firing. Positive identification, armed combatants. She scanned back to the center of the convoy. Boat 4 was different. It sat lower in the water, heavier. The heat bloom from its engines was more intense, suggesting additional weight, probably armor plating. That was the payload boat. That was Volkov. The convoy was 5 miles out and closing fast. She could see their wakes now, white foam trails cutting through the dark water. They were making 40 knots, running hard for the coast. Suddenly, the lead boat cut its speed. The bow settled into the water, the wake disappearing. The entire convoy slowed in reaction, engines downshifting to a low, menacing rumble that she could feel through the steel of the platform. Why were they stopping? A beam of light erupted from the lead boat, blindingly bright even through the scope. A high-intensity spotlight began sweeping the water, checking for obstacles. The beam moved methodically, searching the channel, then tilted upward. It was checking the lighthouse. Vesper shut her eyes tight and buried her face in the rifle stock, making herself as small as possible behind the concrete base of the lantern room. The light swept over the platform like a physical touch. If the operator down there caught the glint of a lens or the outline of the tripod, she was dead. A 12.7mm round would turn the metal grating into shrapnel. She counted seconds. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3. The spotlight snapped off. The engines revved and the convoy accelerated again. They'd just been checking the landmark, making sure they were on course. They felt safe. They thought the storm owned the night. They were wrong. The boats were picking up speed again, their bows lifting as they gained way. They were entering the kill zone. Vesper settled back behind the scope and made her final adjustments. The boats were quartering away from her now, which added a vertical component to the lead calculation. She had to shoot high and left to hit engines on the right side of the formation. Boat 7 rear engine, she murmured. Establishing her firing order, she would start from the back and work forward. If she hit the lead boat first, the convoy would scatter. If she crippled the rear vessels, the others might think it was mechanical failure in the storm. Confusion was her ally. She tracked the trailing boat through the scope. The twin outboards were glowing white rectangles bobbing in the heavy chop. She waited for the top of a swell the split second when the boat hung suspended before crashing down into the next trough. She exhaled halfway and held it. The crosshairs settled on the starboard engine cowling. Send it. The trigger broke clean. The Mk-13 kicked into her shoulder with authority, 300 Winchester. Magnum wasn't a gentle round. The suppressor swallowed most of the muzzle flash, but the recoil was still significant. Her hands moved automatically, muscle memory taking over. Up, back, forward, down. The bolt cycled smoothly, ejecting the spent case with a metallic ping, a fresh round chambered. Through the scope, she watched the result. 820 meters away, a spray of white-hot sparks erupted from the back of Boat 7. The engine didn't just die, it shattered. The cowling exploded, internal components flying apart in a shower of metal and oil. The boat yawed violently to the right as the remaining port engines spun it into an uncontrollable turn. 1. Vesper was already traversing the rifle-shifting targets. She swept past the confused middle boats, tracking all the way to the front. Boat 1 the leader. Take out the rear and they couldn't retreat. Take out the leader and they couldn't advance. Turn the channel into a parking lot. The lead boat was alert now. The sudden loss of their rear guard had been noticed. The spotlights swept backward, searching for their missing comrade. The boat slowed its bow dropping, creating a smaller, less predictable target. Vesper settled the reticle and waited for the pause between swells. The boat dipped into a trough, disappeared from view, then surged upward on a crest of foam. Now, the rifle slammed her shoulder again. The shot felt perfect, one of those releases where you know before impact that the bullet is going exactly where you want it. 800 meters away, the lead boat's port engine detonated. The fuel line ignited and a flare of heat punched into the night sky like a signal flare. The boat slewed sideways, lost steering, and slammed broadside into the next wave. 2. Chaos erupted in the convoy. The 4 boats in the middle were now trapped between burning wrecks fore and aft. They were boxed in with nowhere to run. Vesper racked the bolt again. Clack, clack. The sound was crisp, mechanical, beautiful. She was in the zone now, that state of perfect focus where conscious thought receded and training took over. The element of surprise evaporated. The sound of the impacts and the fires was unmistakable. This wasn't mechanical failure. This was contact. Flares popped from the decks of the remaining boats, hissing red magnesium that fizzled in the rain. Automatic weapons fire began to sparkle from the convoy, aimless bursts of tracer rounds stitching the water. They didn't know where the fire was coming from. They were shooting at ghosts. Vesper didn't hurry. She shifted her aim back to Boat 7, which was still moving on one engine, trying to limp out of the kill zone. Not today. She lined up on the remaining outboard and squeezed the trigger. The round struck the lower unit, shearing off the propeller. The engine over-revved, then seized completely. 3. Boat 7 was now dead weight, drifting with the current. The heavy machine gun on the partially disabled lead boat was traversing now, the gunner realizing that death was coming from above. Tracers started to arc upward, probing for the lighthouse. Vesper shifted her aim. Priority target. She centered the crosshairs on the gunner's heat signature, a bright white torso behind the glowing barrel. The rifle bucked. Down below, the gunner crumpled, falling backward over the ammunition boxes. The stream of tracers cut out instantly. 4. But the other boats had found her general direction now. Small arms fire erupted from multiple sources, AK-47s, PKM machine guns. They began to rake the top of the lighthouse, filling the air with supersonic cracks as bullets passed overhead. Vesper rolled right, dragging the rifle across the platform. Shoot and move. Never fire twice from the same position when the enemy is awake and angry. She reset the tripod behind a ventilation housing and immediately engaged Boat 2, which was trying to accelerate away from the wreckage. She caught it broadside the round, punching through the fiberglass and into the engine block. Smoke poured from the cowling. 5. A second shot finished the job, drilling the port engine. Boat 2 went dead in the water. 6. The remaining boats 3 and 5 plus Volkov's armored vessel were trying to break out of the trap. They were weaving through the burning wreckage, pushing their engines to the red line. Vespera engaged Boat 3, the nearest escape attempt. 2 quick shots disabled both engines, leaving it drifting helplessly. 7. 8. Boat 5 was racing for the channel exit, its pilot throwing the vessel into violent, evasive maneuvers. Vespera led the target, accounting for speed and course changes, and put a round through the starboard engine. The boat slowed, but kept moving on its remaining power plant. 9. A second shot stopped it permanently. 10. That left Volkov's boat, the armored payload vessel, carrying enough VX to turn Los Angeles into a graveyard. It was alone now, its escort stripped away, making a desperate run for open water. Vespera checked her ammunition. She had 15 rounds left, one target. The math should have been easy, but Volkov's boat was different. Heavier armor, probably reinforced engine compartments. And the pilot was good professional. He wasn't panicking like the others. He was using the burning hulks as cover, timing his movement for maximum protection. The boat shot out from behind the wreckage of the lead vessel, banking hard for the channel mouth. It was fast, 45 knots, and climbing. Vespera tracked it through the scope, her body locked to the rifle. Distance, 850 meters. Speed, 45 knots. Wind, 35 mile, full value. The math was brutal. She had to aim almost 10 feet in front of the boat to intercept the engines at the stern. It was an impossible shot in any conditions. In a typhoon, it was beyond impossible. But impossible was what she did. She settled the crosshairs on a point in empty space, not where the boat was, but where it would be in 1.3 seconds. She exhaled, found her natural respiratory pause, and squeezed. The rifle roared. Through the scope, she saw the result. A heartbeat later, the starboard engine of Volkov's boat disintegrated. The round had struck the powerhead, shattering the pistons and seizing the engine instantly. The boat, traveling at nearly 50 mph, suddenly lost half its thrust. It hooked violently to the right, throwing the pilot against the console. But the port engine was still running, still pushing the vessel in an uncontrolled circle. It was wounded but not stopped. 11. Vespera cycled the bolt and reacquired the target. The boat was broadside to her, now spinning in the chop. The remaining engine was exposed, glowing like a beacon in the thermal vision. This was it, the final shot, the last word. She didn't think about the cold or the exhaustion or the fact that she was outnumbered and alone on a platform 80 feet above a hostile sea. She thought about the mathematics of death, velocity, distance, wind drift, target movement. She thought about her father's promise, "Someday you'll eclipse me." Tonight was someday. She exhaled, paused, and broke the trigger. The round crossed 800 meters of storm-lashed darkness in just over a second. It struck the port engine dead center. The fuel rail ignited in a catastrophic fireball that lit up the rain for hundreds of meters around. The explosion blew the engine cover off, sending it spinning into the night like a discus. Volkov's boat lost all power. It settled heavily into the water, burning, drifting, finished. 12. Vespera held the trigger back, trapping the follow-through. She watched through the thermal scope as the heat signature of the engines faded, replaced by the chaotic thermal bloom of fire. No movement, no power. The convoy was destroyed. She opened the bolt, ejecting the final case. It landed on the grating with a hollow ping. She left the bolt open, empty, chamber, empty, magazine, Winchester. The silence that returned to the lighthouse was profound. The heavy machine guns had stopped. The engines had stopped. There was only the sound of wind and rain and the ocean reclaiming what remained of Volkov's flotilla. Vespera slumped forward, resting her forehead on the cold steel of the rifle receiver. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the long night evaporated in an instant, leaving her feeling hollow and infinitely tired. She reached for the infrared strobe on her shoulder harness and clicked it on. The tiny light began to pulse, invisible to the naked eye, but screaming into the darkness for anyone with night vision to see. "I'm here. I'm alive. Come get me." Hey. The silence didn't last long. Down on the water, angry voices drifted up from the few survivors clinging to debris. Then the shooting started again, sporadic, desperate fire from men who knew they were going to die, but wanted to take someone with them. Bullets pinged off the metal grating around her, sparking in the dark. A round slapped into the concrete inches above her head, sending dust into her hair. Vesper didn't move. She didn't have the energy to move. She simply lay there behind the rifle watching the infrared strobe blink on her shoulder. Flash dark, flash dark. It was like a heartbeat, the only one she had left. She wondered if the SEALs were coming or if the Mark V was still dead in the water somewhere drifting toward the open Pacific. If they didn't come, she would die here. Not from the bullets the survivors were shooting, wild more from anger than any hope of hitting her, but from the cold. The hypothermia was winning. Her vision was tunneling the world going gray around the edges. Then she heard a new sound cutting through the storm. It wasn't the throaty roar of smugglers' outboards. It was a high-pitched whine like turbines spooling up. It was getting louder. Vespera forced her heavy eyelids open. Out of the darkness to the south, a black shape emerged from the storm. It smashed through the waves with the kind of violence that spoke of military-grade horsepower. The Mark V. The boat didn't slow down. It roared into the debris field at full speed, its bow waves swamping the smaller wreckage. The survivors in the water turned their weapons toward this new threat. The Mark V answered with overwhelming firepower. The twin M134 miniguns mounted on its rails opened up with a sound like the world's largest chainsaw. A stream of red tracers so dense it looked like a solid laser swept across the water, touching boats and men and erasing them in clouds of splinters and spray. The return fire ceased instantly. There was no fight left, only cleanup. Ghost sound off. The voice was amplified by a hailer, Crawford frantic and desperate. Ghost report. Vesper tried to shout, but her throat was frozen shut. She managed a weak croak and reached up to tap the IR strobe, making it blink faster. Below, she heard boots hitting the metal ladder, fast, aggressive climbing. They were coming up. Crawford vaulted over the railing, weapon raised, scanning the platform. He saw the empty brass cases scattered on the deck, the tripod, the thermal scope still glowing green. Then he saw her. He dropped his rifle and fell to his knees beside her, pulling her up from where she lay curled around the rifle. Talk to me, Ghost. Talk to me. His hands were warm, burning hot against her frozen skin. She flinched. Crawford saw the blood on her face, the gash on her cheek, the waxy pallor of severe hypothermia. Medic, he screamed down the ladder. Get the warming blankets. Get the IVs now. He ripped off his heavy jacket and wrapped it around her, pulling her against his body armor to share what heat he could. You magnificent, impossible woman, he whispered, his voice cracking. He looked out over the railing at the burning wreckage scattered across the channel. He counted the fires, the dead engines floating in the water. 14, Vespera whispered the word barely intelligible. Crawford put at his ear to her lips. What? 14 engines, she breathed. 14 hits. Crawford stared at her, then looked at the empty rifle case, then at the brass scattered around the platform. He looked back at the water, counting the destroyed boats. Yeah, he said, his voice thick with something he'd never admit to feeling. I see them, Ghost. I see them all. He scooped her up in his arms, lifting her easily. She weighed nothing, just bone and determination, and the kind of courage that couldn't be taught. Let's go home, he said. Vespera let the darkness take her. She didn't have to swim anymore. She didn't have to shoot anymore. The gap had been held. The wolves had been stopped. The sheep were safe. Yeah. Epilogue. 6 weeks later, the morning was crisp and clear at Arlington National Cemetery. The Virginia autumn painted the trees in shades of gold and crimson. Staff Sergeant Vespera Kane stood before a white marble headstone in Section 60, wearing her dress blues with a new addition, the Navy Cross ribbon, among her decorations. The headstone read, Senior Chief David Kane, SEAL Team 6 killed in action, Syria 2019, age 51. She placed a brass coin on the marble ledge. Crawford's challenge coin, battered and worn, carried through 3 decades of operations. The inscription on one side read Special Warfare Operator. On the other, the only easy day was yesterday. They gave me the program, Dad, she said quietly. Full integration approved. Crawford recommended me personally, said I earned it the hard way. She stood at attention, rendered a sharp salute, held it for 3 heartbeats, then let her hand fall. Admiral Stone says there are 12 women in the pipeline now. All of them volunteers. All of them know what it done. She touched the scar on her cheek. 17 stitches had closed the shrapnel wound, but the mark would never fade. I showed them it could be done. That's what you wanted, wasn't it? For me to eclipse you. A voice behind her made her turn. Crawford approached along the gravel path wearing civilian clothes, jeans, a jacket, the kind of normal attire that looked strange on a man more comfortable in tactical gear. Talking to the old man, he asked, telling him about the new assignment. Devgru wants me for Red Squadron. Crawford nodded. They're lucky to get you. When do you report? Next week, but Crawford... She paused. Thank you for giving me the chance, for coming to get me. You earned it, Kane, every bit of it. He looked at the headstone. Your father would be proud. I think he would be too. They walked together toward the parking area, their footsteps crunching on the gravel. The autumn sun was warm on their faces, and for the first time in months, Vespera felt genuinely warm all the way through. One question, Crawford said as they reached the parking lot. That night on the lighthouse when everything was going to hell, and you were half frozen and outnumbered, what kept you going? What made the difference? Vespera stopped walking. She pulled her father's dog tags from beneath her uniform blouse and held them for a moment, feeling their familiar weight. I remembered something my father told me when I was 12, she said. He said that someday I'd have to stand in the gap between the wolves and the sheep, between the darkness and the light. And he said I'd eclipse him, that I had something he never had. What's that? The ability to see my limits clearly and then ignore them. Crawford smiled, the first genuine smile she'd ever seen from him. And the 12 shots, how do you explain that? 12 targets, 12 hits in conditions that should have made it impossible. Vespera looked back toward the cemetery, toward her father's grave, toward all the names carved in marble and stone. Some people refuse to miss when it matters. I guess I'm one of them. She got in her car and drove away, leaving Crawford standing in the parking lot. In the rearview mirror, she watched him walk back toward the cemetery, probably to spend some time with his own ghosts, his own promises to keep. The radio was playing something soft and instrumental. She didn't recognize the song, but it reminded her of home, of family, of the people worth fighting for. She thought about the 12 women following in her wake and the responsibility that came with breaking barriers. Her phone buzzed with a text message. She read it at the next red light. Saw the news about your new assignment. Your father knew you'd eclipse him. So did I. Come visit when you can. Love, Mom. Vespera smiled and typed back, on my way. She closed the phone and drove north toward home, carrying her father's dog tags and Crawford's coin, and the knowledge that she'd stood in the gap when it mattered most. Behind her, Arlington faded into the distance, but the weight of its lessons would stay with her forever. The scar on her face caught the afternoon sunlight, a reminder of the night she refused to die, refused to miss, refused to let the darkness win. When people asked about it, and they always did, she'd smile and say what Crawford had suggested, bar fight in Manila. You should see the other guy. Let them wonder. The ocean kept its secrets, and so would she. But deep in the classified files locked behind security clearances most people would never have, there was a thin folder marked only with a date and a designation, Operation Neptune's Wrath. Inside was a single page typed in official. Mission summary. Interdiction of high-value target. Dr. Dmitry Volkov and associated VX nerve agent shipment. All objectives achieved. 0 friendly casualties. Enemy force completely eliminated. Notable actions. Staff Sergeant Vespera M. Kane, USMC, conducted solo insertion via open water transit in adverse conditions. Sea State 6 storm. Established precision fire position on elevated structure. Engaged and destroyed 7 hostile vessels with 14 precision rifle shots. Demonstrated exceptional marksmanship, physical endurance, and tactical judgment under extreme duress. Recommendation SSJ Kane approved for full integration into Naval Special Warfare Operations. Performance exceeded all expectations. Filed by Commander J. Crawford, SEAL Team 4. At the bottom of the page, stamped in red ink, were 2 words, mission success. The file was sealed, classified, forgotten, by everyone except the few who had been there. But they would never forget the woman who swam the gap, made the shots, and proved that courage has no gender. The woman who eclipsed them all?